earliest job in life was working at an animal shelter. And it was exactly what you can imagine it was. We would feed the animals, and then we would clean up after them. Meant we were picking up, and cleaning out litter boxes and cleaning up dog runs. And my sister and I worked there on weekends when we were young teenagers and really kind of through some high school years. And I think we got connected with doing this job because of one of my sister's friends. She worked there sometimes when she showed up. And she wasn't always very reliable. And I remember that my mom was giving us a little bit of one of those mother lectures on the drive to the animal shelter one Saturday morning and said, now, don't tell your manager that you're really close friends with this girl because she's not very reliable at showing up for work. And my mom says, because you know how that goes, birds of a feather flock together. Which means that if the manager knew that my sister was good friends with this other girl, and this other girl was not a very reliable employee, well, then that must mean then that my sister wouldn't be a very reliable employee, and thus me not a very reliable employee. And so my mom didn't want us to get that kind of reputation because we hung out with a girl who wasn't a very reliable employee because, as the saying goes, birds of a feather. Right. So that may very well be some of the underlying bewilderment of the Pharisees on why they asked the question of Jesus' disciples. Jesus is eating at Matthew's house. He's just told Matthew, the tax collector, come follow me. And there's a dinner held at Matthew's house, and all these people have gathered there. And the Pharisees show up, and they're looking on at what's going on, and they say to Jesus' disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Tax collectors and sinners. It's such a great catch-all, isn't it? It's just perfect for anybody who doesn't belong. You group them into tax collectors and sinners. So a little bit about why they were grouped together and were considered not to belong. First of all, tax collectors. Tax collectors were these people, Jewish people, who bought the rights in order to collect taxes in a region. So let me put it in this way. Let's say I bought the rights from the state of Illinois to collect taxes in Crystal Lake. I could go knock on every one of your houses who live in Crystal Lake and say, pay up, pay me, and it was my money. And I could say, this is how much you owe. That's what they were doing. And they were not liked, they were not valued people because of a couple things. Number one, they were considered to be traitors to the Jewish people. They had sold out to the occupying Roman government who was taking over their country and collecting taxes for the emperor. So they were considered to be, if you use our words, unpatriotic, okay? The second thing is that they were in close contact with Gentiles. They would collect taxes from Gentiles as well. And Gentiles were people who were considered unclean. They were eating foods that were considered unclean. They did not necessarily observe Jewish purity laws, and they were unclean. They did not follow the Mosaic laws, and they were thus considered unclean. And a good Jew would not sit with anyone who was considered unclean. Being unclean is what a good Jewish person would work hard to avoid. You didn't want to be considered unclean. And you would keep away from anyone who was considered unclean. Because if you were unclean, you were unable to enter the temple. you were considered not appropriate before the Lord. The door was closed to you. And what made you unclean might not be anything that you think about right now. In Leviticus and in the book of Numbers, becoming unclean might be through some really kind of everyday things, like giving birth. I know that's not an everyday thing, but it happens regularly enough, right? I mean, yes, we have a little one here, right here in the front, who's getting ready to be baptized. And so if you had given birth, you were considered ritually unclean for a season. If you had a relative who died and you attended to their body and you carried their body and you anointed their body and you wrapped their body and you buried their body, you are now considered unclean because you have touched a dead body. Having a skin disease, even if it was something like acne, you get a breakout, you are considered unclean. And of course, eating certain foods, like the bacon that I had for breakfast this morning, would have been considered unclean. Yes, I did eat bacon. It really is true. So it was these things that you did, but also, if someone was unclean because of any one of those things, and you were close to that person, their uncleanness could be transferred to you. That was how they understood it. It was in Leviticus, right here. It says, or if he touches human uncleanness, anything by which one becomes unclean, even if he's unaware of it, when he realizes it, he is guilty. So, that means uncleanness was transferred. So people would avoid anyone who's unclean. As a matter of fact, the systems were set up. If you had any kind of a skin disease, if you had leprosy or something like that, you were told you had to leave town, you had to live on the edge of town, and if anyone came close to you, you had to holler out, unclean, 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 meaning don't come near me, because my uncleanness will be transferred to you. Can you imagine living like that on the edge of town? Having to warn everyone from coming close to you. So while tax collectors were not necessarily having committed a sin as we think of sins, because of their closeness to Gentiles, they were considered unclean because the Gentiles' uncleanliness was transferred to the tax collectors. But then there's also the good old designation of sinners, right? The sinners. Who are they? Those people are the people who've done something wrong. All those things that you might automatically come to mind, like theft and adultery and that sort of thing, but it also could include things like this: not adhering strictly to the law, not tithing, not making the proper sacrifices, or following purity customs. They were considered people who didn't do all of that. They were considered religious outcasts, unworthy to be associated with. In other words, you kept your distance from tax collectors and sinners so that their impurity would not be imputed upon you. Or, as the saying goes, because birds of a feather flock together. Which is why keeping away from people who might make you unclean was quite common for the religious folk. And that is why the question came to Jesus' disciples. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? It just didn't make sense for those Pharisees. And we can understand that. We still operate with a little bit of that. I know parents, myself included, who have always been worried about your kid hanging out with the wrong crowd, and you want to keep them away from the wrong crowd because you're afraid that the wrong crowd might corrupt your kid, right? Or why church folk keep away from certain institutions. You know, like you don't recognize each other when you're at Garfield's or something like that, you know? Thank you for laughing. So why would Jesus eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why would Jesus do that? Why would he risk sullying his reputation? Why would he risk becoming ritually unclean through association with unclean people? Well, I think it's because Jesus operated completely differently than us. He operated not with the assumption that human uncleanness would transfer to him, but he operated with the knowledge that his cleanness, his wholeness, his shalom would be transferred to others. That is how Jesus works. And that was a whole new religious concept for those folks. It wasn't a new idea. The prophets of old had been saying it for years and years and years and years, but it wasn't incorporated into religious practice. That's why Jesus quoted Hosea, who had written, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And Jesus told the people who were asking the question, "Why would you be eating with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus says, "I want you to learn what it means. Mercy. Learn the power of mercy. Learn what mercy can do for people. Learn how if you extend that mercy, healing takes place." Jesus says, go and learn what this means. You see, because God is wanting a community, a kingdom that's built on restoration, not perfectionism. Perfectionism, you see, is that process by which we try and be so perfect. We are concerned with always making sure that that we're doing the right thing, that it will qualify us, that we will be qualified for God's love, that we will be qualified to be able to enter the temple, that we'll be qualified for God's to accept our sacrifice and our offering. And also perfectionism then is very much about determining who is out, who the doors are closed to. But a community built on mercy will always be concerned with bringing people into community, finding people who've been left out, and restoring them to a full relationship with God. And let's face it, that includes every single one of us needing to be restored to a full relationship with God through the mercy of Jesus Christ our Lord. That's every single one of us. And so, Jesus sat at the table with tax collectors and sinners, and he built a kingdom based on people who became clean because they drew near to Jesus. His mercy made them clean. Kim shared with us that story. His mercy restored them, and his mercy is extended to each one of us still today, and to those outside of our doors. And why? Because God loved and cared for the world so much that he sent his Son. And as Jesus told Nicodemus, that God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. This is why we celebrate God's love. This is the community that we get to be a part of because of Jesus' mercy. And we celebrate that through the sacrament of baptism.